You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Let's begin our program today with the Iran nuclear deal. Earlier this month, the U.S. withdrew from the accord and reimposed the sanctions on Iran. Since then, the other 6 signatories have tried to save the agreement. On Monday, EU foreign ministers gathered to discuss ways to preserve the joint comprehensive plan for action after representatives of 6 remaining parties met in Vienna last week. Before we get down to business to talk about the latest with the Iran nuclear deal, let's take a look at this.
Efforts to salvage the U.S. abandoned nuclear deal. EU foreign ministers met in Brussels and sought to protect the bloc's strategic and economic interests in Iran in the wake of the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA and mounting pressure on European countries.
We're mainly discussing about measures to preserve the agreement and our economic commitments with Iran. But for us, this is not about an economic interest. This is about a security interest.
Mogherini also stressed that the latest report of the International Atomic Energy Agency said Iran was adhering to the accord. This meeting came just 3 days after another discussion focusing on Iran issues in Vienna last Friday. Representatives of China, the UK, France, Germany and Russia met with Tehran officials for talks to save the deal.
We got the sense that Europeans and Russia and China, as remaining participants to the JCPOA, are serious. And they recognize that JCPOA's survival depends on the interests of Iran to be respected.
Arakchi said Iran wanted a package of incentives on the table, as well as legal and political guarantees that ensure the deal's survival without U.S. involvement. Also last week in St. Petersburg, Russian President Vladimir Putin and visiting French President Emmanuel Macron have exchanged views on the deal.
Iran fully delivered on its obligations under the deal, and therefore we have to question what is the basis of the dismantling of this deal and this arrangement. The consequences, I believe, can be very lamentable, but we can welcome the sentiment of France and the whole of Europe who aim to retain this deal.
Next week, Chinese President Xi Jinping will meet with Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, who will be on a visit to China to attend the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. U.S. withdrawal was not the death knell of the deal, but a setback other signatories are willing to work around.
So, how salvageable is the Iran nuclear deal? Let's have our panelists weigh in. We have in our Beijing studio Li Guofu, who is the director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies in China's Institute of International Studies. Good to have you once again, sir, on our program. In Tehran, we have Gambar Nadari, who is a political analyst and columnist from the Kayhan International newspaper. Welcome, sir. In Berlin, Germany, we are joined by Matteo Garavaglia, who is a research associate at the University of Oxford Center for International Studies. Welcome as well. Let me begin with you, Mr. Nadari. What do you think about the possibility Iran work with the other parties beside the United States of JCPOA to make sure the deal will continue?
Well, Tian Wei, the deal is going to continue. But we are cautiously optimistic. We know that China and Russia are serious, as you just mentioned in your earlier report. We also know that politically the EU wants to save this important deal, as Mogherini said, for security reasons. But we also know that EU governments have told their companies that it is totally up to them to stay in Iran and do business. But they have also said that they are going to support them in order to make sure that America doesn't hit them financially through financial penalties or something like that. But at the end of the day, we are more than happy to continue this deal with the remaining parties to the deal, because we know that it's a win-win situation for all the parties involved. But at the end of the day, I think there are still ways that we can get America back to the negotiating table in order to get them involved again in this important historic deal.
Well, Mr. Nadary just said something very interesting and very important. You can have a few ways to get the Americans back to the negotiation table and back to the deal. I'm going to ask you a little bit about that later in our program. For now, let me go to Mr. Garavaglia, talking about the Europeans' role. We see the Europeans, some of the two countries, Germany and France, both are on the JCPOA deal, have been very active in their diplomacy. French president visiting Russia, well, that's rare. Of course, another thing not necessarily rare, German Chancellor Angela Merkel visiting China. But you see these interactions. Are European countries, particularly these two, going to be the backbone of keeping this deal? Or they are going to be the early ones who is more nervous than all the others in this deal?
Well, Europe has a role to play here. Europe can be the region, the power that keeps the deal afloat and keeps it going despite the setback with the U.S. There are, however, two conditions here to be fulfilled. The first one is to see whether Europe can manage to build a coalition of the willing, so to speak, together with Russia, together with China, together with another set of countries to keep the deal alive by providing a further set of both carrots and sticks in dealing with Iran, despite what the United States might do. On the other hand, second key condition is the issue is to see to what extent Europeans will manage to maintain unity amongst themselves. The United States is suggesting imposing sanctions on those European companies that were to trade and do business with Iran. Europeans had to stand firm in that respect and push back. One way to do so could be the blocking statutes. This is something that was brought out already in 1996 that the European Union used when dealing with both Libya and Cuba, that effectively says that European companies will be forced to ignore any sanctions or legislation that the United States will try to apply on European companies.
Yeah, but, you know, Mr. Garavaglia, I have to say the two conditions you just proposed. One is whether there's a coalition of the willing. Yes, there is the coalition of the willing. It's not the Russia and China that's the problem. It's rather whether determined or not the European countries and the EU is the big question mark. Under that circumstances, how will the Europeans' unity, which is not necessarily a case, if you look at the EU's history, will be the cornerstone for keeping the deal still? We do not know. Having said that, though, let me come back to you, Mr. Nadary, in Iran. Talking about business, European business, we see very different directions of European business, particularly at the very beginning when the U.S. announced to scrap off this deal. You see Total, French company, I'm not saying all French companies, I'm just saying Total itself, has decided to leave Iran. The company has only one person there, and that person probably is also going to leave if you look at the latest news. But you look at German companies, at the very beginning, Mr. Nadary at least, German companies are saying, we don't accept this coming from the United States. But you have also noticed, Mr. Nadary, German companies recently have been very quiet about what they are going to do. So that is a big question mark. Will the politicians really drive the deal? Or will the business be the polar to hold the deal together? Mr. Nadary.
Well, Tianwei, we are suffering immensely economically, and we want business. We want business partners. As I told you earlier, Europeans are sending mixed signals, and that worries us a lot because that affects the value of our currency, our production, and so many other things, even our day-to-day lives here. So we take these wrong signals or mixed signals very seriously. When Total leaves here, yes, we have China on our side, and they are going to fill up the gap for us. But why not having a multilateral partnership and joint venture in Iran, in which everybody enjoys the economic benefits of these windfall deals in this lucrative business market. So it's a shame that Europeans are leaving, the big ones, of course, and that sends us a strong message that there will be some smaller companies that are willing to stay here from Europe, and they are more than welcome to do that. But at the end of the day, I don't think that with small incentives, Iran is going to sit on its hands and watch America impose crippling sanctions against Iran. As they said, it is going to be the biggest and the strongest sanctions in history. Iran is going to react.
The total deal, it's a very interesting case study. In a way, it could reflect some of the models, how things would work if things continue. And Mr. Lee, I want to invite your opinion here. That is, now Total has been asking for 2 months, and Iranian government has agreed to give Total 2 months so-called time to seek exemption from the U.S. sanctions against companies that are working with Iran. We don't know whether that deal eventually will come out between Total and the U.S. government, but we do know that if it doesn't come out, there is one option, that is Chinese company might come in, who is now having 30% of the share, not going to come in and take over the 50% share that Total used to have. So here's the thing. Will China want to play that role, Mr. Lee? Is it really in China's interest to play that role? Is this specific case study going to be replicated in other areas and in other companies if things going sour, Mr. Lee?
I think, of course, the area of the operation in South Pass and the 11 areas, it is very rich.
Those are the areas for the oil deals.
Yeah, oil deals, and the area is very rich in both oil and gas. Yes. And China is one part of the joint ventures. We have 30% of the share of the total contracts. And once Total leaves, and it is very likely, according to the latest developments. Yeah. And the Iranian side has expressed its willingness to invite China to take over the Total's share. Yeah. And but we know that we are facing a new situation, and from the economic point of view, it will be very beneficial from if we have taken the Total's shares.
For but individual company.
Yeah, for the companies, China oil companies, Yeah. But from the political against the current situations, there has been high stake involved. There's a lot of risks here. Yes. I'm not very much sure that whether China at that moment would take over or not.
Right. Well, that is one deal we are looking at. Of course, all of this, because of the political difficulties, have become extremely tricky now, Mr. Lee. Having said that, though, I want to go to you, Mr. Garavalia. If the deal could be kept, I mean, at least for Total, seek an exemption coming from the United States about sanctions, will other companies follow suit, or Total is going to be a very different case compared to the other companies? Let's just say German companies.
No, I don't think this will be, I don't think we'll have Total getting special treatment and other companies not getting that. I think this will be a deal for all or a deal for none. That is to say, Europe, China, Russia will be on the same boat in this. They will have to find ways, A, to fight back secondary sanctions from the United States, so using effectively blocking statute, telling their own companies they will be legally bound not to respect sanctions imposed by the United States. On top of it, Europe, Russia, and China might consider placing secondary sanctions on the U.S. in return. So they could say, well, if the United States is going to do that, we're going to do that back to the United States. Thirdly, again, Russia, China, Europe altogether might want to commit to buy certain amount of Iranian oil so as to maintain demand going for Iranian oil, as well as extending government export and import guarantees of different kinds, for instance, by denominating them also in other currencies. The European Investment Bank is working on that, to do that in euros, for instance. These are just some examples of things that all these powers can do in a way to either push the Americans to come back to the table, or, should that fail, effectively leave the United States as the odd one out and isolate the United States and keep this deal going between Iran and effectively the rest of the world. So we might have a situation a little bit like with the Paris climate deal, or as well more broadly with issues having to do with protectionism and global trade, whereby the United States ends up isolating itself and the rest of the world moves forward.
We don't know yet, Mr. Garavaglia. I think that is the biggest trick over here. And having said that, though, there is also the issue that China, Russia, the European countries, as well as the EU in the JCPOA deal has to face with. One is that the direction that U.S. is going to impose unilateral sanctions for this and for futures to come. That's a possibility if this deal is not being handled well. But secondly, there's also the possibility that Iran could, in a way, with internal political pressure, give up the nuclear deal. I mean, the nuclear prevention deal, 1968, Iran signed on to it. So are many countries around the world. And that is also going to be a domino effect. So actually, a lot is here at stake. It's not just about one European company. It's actually about the order of the world here, Mr. Garavaglia, particularly if you think about some of the other hotspot issues going on in the world, particularly related to all of the issues we're talking here. So is that stake being well understood by European capitals?
I think very much so. I think Europeans view all this issue with Iran not in terms of trade, not in terms of business. For Europeans, this is primarily a security issue. And indeed, we already have an arms race in the Middle East. We already have an arms race in the Middle East. Now, the question is whether we're going to get a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Israel already has nuclear weapons. If Iran pulls out and decides to go ahead and acquire nuclear weapons, well, almost nothing would stop Saudi Arabia and possibly Egypt from doing the same. And then hell knows what's going to come out of all this.
Right. Mr. Li from China, is there something that China could do to bring all the parties together? I'm not talking about the United States, because China and the United States now have enormous amount of issues to sort out between themselves, but rather the other parties of the JCPOA. Mr. Li.
I think, China may not, to be added to get it, or, the rest of, the signatory countries. Certainly China would be working very closely and coordinated, what we can do in order to preserve the deal, because we attached a very importance to the deal. It is, to prevent, largest scale of the war and the nuclear arms race in the Middle East. And whether, the international community or the remaining parties can successfully working together to keep the deal alive. I think this is a big challenges for all the remaining, I think, the signatories countries.
Well, I understand the Iranian president, Mr. Nadary, is going to visit China. I mean, on the occasion of the SCO, that's a multilateral platform, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So, Mr. Nadary, you earlier said there are several ways that the countries could bring the United States back to the deal, at least to the negotiation table. What are those possible ways? Is the Iranian president going to explore those ways with China and some of the others at the SCO summit, for example, with Russia, with some of the other countries present as well, Mr. Nadary?
Well, that's a good question, and we have already sent some signals, very powerful signals
like
to the United States that we are willing to talk about Yemen, the war in Yemen. So if we want help, we need some mediators, and China and Russia could pretty much help us in order to sit at the negotiating tables to sort out and end the unnecessary war in Yemen. We know that Saudi Arabia, as you just mentioned, wants some excuses to start a new nuclear race in the region. But that excuse is going to be taken away from Saudi Arabia if we help end the war in Yemen, which is costing Saudi Arabia money and blood. So that is a goodwill gesture from that's only the beginning. Iran could also start negotiations in order to support America in Iraq and Syria. We know that in the past they have worked together to fight and defeat ISIS in Iraq. I don't see any reason why America and Iran cannot continue this kind of constructive dialogue and cooperation from now on. I think China and Russia have a lot on their plates, and they could pretty much help us in order to get back America to the negotiating tables and start from Yemen.
All right. What do you think, the other two gentlemen? What could work to make things happen? Again, very briefly, each one for 1 minute. Let's go to Mr. Garavaglia first.
Sorry, I couldn't hear the end of the question.
The question is how to get everybody back to the negotiation table, at least, if not the deal itself.
Fundamentally, I would say we need to do two things at the same time. We need to offer the Iranians a greater commitment in terms of carrots, in terms of economic opportunities to come back to the international community.
All right.
On the one hand. And at the same time, we have to make clear to the United States that they will be the great losers of all this if they'll stay out of it, because Russia, Europe, China altogether could apply blocking statutes and secondary sanctions on the United States itself.
All right, Mr. Lee, of course, China and the United States already have a lot on their plates to deal with one another, given the latest trade dispute. So, Mr. Lee, is there a way, once again, China could bring the United States back to the negotiation table, if not the deal itself?
I'm very much sure China and or anyone else can bring U.S. back to the negotiation tables. And but China can together, as I said earlier on, working closely with the rest of the parties to keep the deal alive.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. Li Guofu, Gambarnadari, and Matteo Garavaglia. Really appreciate it. Thank you for your insights.